the scream ripped from my throat before I fully registered making it. A raw, primal sound of pure terror as the dark figure lunged from the doorway of my sweet Elysium Pines, snatching the only thing tethering me to reality, a tiny, miraculously functional burner phone, from my weakened grasp. The connection to the 911 operator, that fragile lifeline, severed mid-plea. My desperate words, "He's holding me, my son," dissolving into the sterile air. Then came the blow. Not a punch, nothing so overtly brutal, but a stinging, humiliating slap across the cheek that sent me sprawling onto the uncomfortably stiff mattress of the medical-grade bed. I, Evelyn Price, 72 years old, widow, retired professor of Gothic literature, a woman who had never known a hand raised to her in violence, now lay stunned on the rumpled sheets of this so-called elite wellness retreat, my world shrinking to the menacing shadow looming over me. "Quiet now, Mother," a voice hissed, a voice I'd known intimately my entire life, David's voice, yet horribly distorted, roughened by something alien, a narcotic haze, perhaps, or the chilling tendrils of induced madness. "You wouldn't want to upset Dr. Thorne, would you? He's taking such good care of you." Taking care of me? That creature, Dr. Elias Thorne, with his surgeon's ice-chip eyes, and a Mephistophelian smile that never reached them, had been the one to inform me, just 2 days ago, when I'd rushed here from Chicago, after receiving an alarming call about David's setback, that my son had ascended to a new therapeutic plateau, and that I apparently had signed documents consenting to my own voluntary admission for comprehensive assessment due to age-related cognitive decline. Lies, all of it, monstrous, audacious lies. I'd signed nothing of the sort, merely a visitor's log, but who would believe an old woman already labeled as senile by her own son and the respectable chief physician of this gilded cage? That burner phone. It had been my only sliver of hope. I'd found it by sheer chance, tucked behind the bedside cabinet, likely dropped by a previous equally desperate guest. The battery had been nearly depleted, showing a single defiant red bar, but it had been enough to dial 911. And now it was gone. David, or whatever abomination they had molded him into in this accursed place, stood over me, breathing heavily, his eyes wild, pupils dilated like black pools in the dim light filtering through the barred window. In one hand, he clutched the small, shattered phone. In the other, a syringe glinting with some viscous, milky fluid. The same kind of syringe they'd used to calm me these past 2 days, plunging me into a cloying, leaden sleep servicioed with grotesque nightmares. "No, David, please," I whispered, trying to shrink away, but the bed was flush against the cold institutional wall. "What have they done to you? This isn't you." A crooked, unnerving smile twisted his lips, a rictus that sent a shiver of pure dread down my spine. "Oh, but it is me, Mother, the real me. Dr. Thorne has enlightened me, shown me the truth, about everything. About how you've always controlled me, smothered me with your suffocating love. Here, I'm finally free." Free? In this sterile cell with its reinforced windows they euphemistically called safety screens? Under the 24-hour surveillance of orderlies whose faces were impassive masks, whose eyes held no flicker of empathy? With his own mother cowering before him as he brandished a syringe? If this was his definition of freedom, then I'd take a life sentence in the Library of Congress stacks any day. Pure, unadulterated bullshit, is what it was. I had to do something. Think. But what? I was weak, my mind still foggy from their medications, my body aching from the fall I'd taken when he'd first burst in. And he was young, strong, and clearly, terrifyingly, unhinged. David, Listen to me, I pleaded, trying to reach the boy I knew, the sensitive, intelligent son I adored, the one who used to bring me wildflowers he'd picked in the meadow behind our old house. Thorn is deceiving you. He's deceiving all of us. This place. It isn't a sanctuary. It's a trap. Silence, he snarled, the needle in his hand wavering dangerously. The professional, almost academic, veneer I usually maintained in times of crisis was cracking, raw fear seeping through. Dr. Thorne is a visionary, a healer. He helps people. People like me. People like you, Mother. People poisoned by the old world, by their toxic attachments. His words were a jumble of pseudo-philosophical psychobabble, the kind of manipulative rhetoric charlatans have used for centuries to ensnare the vulnerable. But the fanatical gleam in his eyes told me he believed every poisonous syllable. Reason was a lost cause. He was too far gone, his mind thoroughly marinated in Thorne's insidious doctrines. And then, in that moment of sheer, unadulterated terror, with the needle arcing towards my exposed arm, I did the only thing I could. I screamed. Not a whimper of fear, not a plea for mercy. I screamed as I had once screamed on the university stage, playing Hecuba lamenting the fall of Troy, a full-throated, primal roar of defiance, of maternal fury, of a lifetime of suppressed frustrations finally erupting. My voice, trained over decades of lecturing to packed halls without a microphone, filled the small room, bounced off the oppressive, sound-dampening walls, and, I prayed, ripped through the anodyne calm of Elysium pines. David recoiled, his eyes widening in momentary shock, the syringe faltering. That split second was all I needed. I lunged sideways, a desperate, uncoordinated scramble, tumbling off the high bed onto the cold, unforgiving linoleum floor. The impact sent a jarring shock through my arthritic hip, but I barely registered the pain. The syringe flew from his grasp, clattering uselessly beneath the bed. He dove after it, a snarl twisting his features, but I was already scrambling, crab-like, towards the door, my only thought to escape this horrifying parody of my son. The door! If I could just reach the door! If it wasn't locked. But he was faster, fueled by a desperate, drug-induced agility. He cut me off, his body blocking the exit, his face a mask of contorted rage. "You're not going anywhere, you interfering old bitch. You'll ruin everything." "Old bitch," I gasped, a fresh wave of outrage momentarily eclipsing my fear. "You ungrateful whelp." I thought, my mind racing through a litany of sacrifices I'd made for him, from sleepless nights soothing his infant colic to selling my grandmother's diamond brooch, a treasured heirloom, to pay for that fancy coding boot camp he'd insisted would launch his brilliant career. "I'll show you an old bitch." But instead of launching a futile physical assault, a suicidal notion given our respective strength and his current volatile state, I fell back on my most reliable weapon, words, and not just any words. I recalled a lesson from an old eccentric rhetoric professor from my undergraduate days. When brute force fails, employ the unexpected, the theatrical. "David," I said suddenly, my voice dropping to a calm, almost bored conversational tone, my gaze flicking to a point just over his shoulder. "Tell me, who was that rather striking blonde I saw leaving Dr. Thorne's private study late last night, adjusting her attire? She had the most fascinating little birthmark on her neck, shaped rather like a butterfly. I don't believe I've seen her around the facility before. A new patient, perhaps? Or someone on staff with special privileges?" It was pure, unadulterated fabrication, a desperate gamble. I hadn't seen any such blonde. My movements had been severely restricted, my observations limited to the four walls of my room and the impassive faces of my attendants. But I saw the flicker in David's eyes. Confusion, suspicion, a twinge of something that might have been jealousy. Whatever it was, it worked. He hesitated, his head turning almost imperceptibly towards the corridor, as if expecting this mythical blonde to materialize. In that infinitesimal pause, I acted. I didn't try to barrel past him. I did the last thing he would have expected from a frail old bitch. I dropped sharply to my knees, ducked under his outstretched arm, and, once behind him, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength I didn't know I possessed, I kicked out with all my might, aiming for the back of his knees. It was an old self-defense trick my late husband, Arthur, a former Marine, had insisted on teaching me years ago. Just in case, Evie, some damn fool in a dark alley thinks a lady professor is an easy mark. David let out a yelp of surprise and pain as his legs buckled. He didn't go down completely, but he staggered, his balance momentarily compromised. That was my opening. I scrambled to my feet and lunged for the doorknob, yanking it with frantic desperation. Locked. Of course it was locked. These bastards locked everything. Every door in this godforsaken place was a barrier, not an exit. But my scream, it seemed, had not gone entirely unheard. Heavy, hurried footsteps pounded in the corridor outside, accompanied by gruff, male voices. Salvation? Or, more likely, reinforcements from my deranged son and his puppet masters? David was already recovering, his face a snarl of fury. You'll pay for that, mother! He lunged for me again. I sidestepped, narrowly avoiding his grasping hands, and he crashed heavily against the padded wall, another one of Elysium Pine's thoughtful safety features. I knew I couldn't evade him for long in this confined space. I needed help. Desperately. My gaze darted around the room, searching for any advantage, any weapon, any hope. And then I saw it. Mounted high on the ceiling, directly above the door, its red plastic casing almost invisible against the acoustic tiles. A smoke detector. Or, more accurately, a fire alarm pull station. The kind with a small glass panel you had to break. In movies, this always brought the cavalry running. But how to reach it? It was at least 2 feet above my maximum reach. I scanned the room. The chair. A heavy, institutional-grade wooden chair beside a small, bolted-down writing desk. I made a dash for it, but David, anticipating my move, was already on his feet, blocking my path, his eyes burning with a terrifying mixture of rage and something that looked like betrayal, as if I were the one betraying him. "Stay put," he roared, his voice cracking. The sounds outside the door were louder now, a key scraping in the lock. In seconds, they would be in the room. I looked into my son's tormented eyes. There was nothing of the gentle boy I had raised left in them. Only a hollowed-out shell, animated by madness and Thorn's insidious poison. I knew with a chilling certainty that if those orderlies came in now, they would see a disturbed old woman, apparently attacking her concerned son. They would restrain me. They would sedate me. And Thorn would have won. My last chance to expose this monstrous charade would be gone. I had to act, now, before that door opened. I did the only thing left that could possibly break through his drug-addled haze. The one thing that had, on rare occasions in his troubled adolescence, stopped him in his tracks. I looked him dead in the eye, drew myself up to my full, admittedly unimpressive height of 5'3", and unleashed the voice that had once made rowdy lecture halls fall silent. The voice of maternal authority, honed over decades. "David Michael Price," I thundered, using his full name, a name I reserved for moments of extreme displeasure or dire warnings. "You will unhand your mother this instant. Do you hear me? This instant." For a fraction of a second, it worked. A flicker of confusion, of deeply ingrained childhood obedience, crossed his face. His grip on my arm, which he had seized again, loosened almost imperceptibly, and I seized that fraction of a second. I wrenched my arm free, simultaneously spinning away from him and, with a desperate, unladylike heave, swung my handbag, my sturdy leather tote, fortuitously weighted down by the hardcover edition of the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe I'd brought for comfort reading, in a wide, vicious arc. It connected with the sickening thud against the side of his head. David staggered back, a grunt of pain escaping his lips, his eyes momentarily unfocused. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I scrambled onto the heavy wooden chair, my old knees screaming in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire alarm pull station was still just out of reach. I stretched, my fingers brushing against the cool metal casing. 1 more inch. The door to the room burst open. 2 burly orderlies in anodyne blue scrubs rushed in, their faces grim, their movements practiced, efficient. Behind them, I caught a glimpse of Dr. Elias Thorne himself, his usually smooth reptilian features contorted in an expression of cold fury. They were too late for David, but they were just in time for me. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, I kicked off from the chair, launching myself upwards. My fingers closed around the small metal lever of the fire alarm. I pulled hard. There was a tiny, almost insignificant click. And then, the entire world seemed to explode in a cacophony of deafening, ear-splitting sound. Klaxons blared. Strobe lights flashed, turning the corridor outside into a nightmarish disco. And somewhere, deep within the bowels of Elysium Pines, I could hear the distant, growing clang of fire bells. Pandemonium. The orderlies froze, momentarily confused by the sudden sensory overload. Thorne barked an order, but his voice was lost in the din. David, clutching his head, looked dazed, disoriented. This was my chance, my only chance. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled down from the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I dodged around the startled orderlies, who were now trying to assess the source of the alarm, their training clearly not having prepared them for a 72-year-old literary scholar initiating a full-scale emergency evacuation. Thorne saw me. His eyes, those cold reptilian pools, locked onto mine. He started towards me, his limp more pronounced in his haste, his face a mask of murderous rage. "You meddling old fool," he spat, his voice barely audible above the klaxons. "You'll pay for this." But I was already at the door, fumbling with the handle. It was still locked from the outside, but the mechanism had been disengaged when the orderlies burst in. I wrenched it open and plunged into the chaotic corridor. Alarms shrieked, lights flashed. Doors were opening, confused, white-gowned patients and equally bewildered staff members spilling out, their faces a mixture of fear and disorientation. The carefully maintained facade of Elysium Pines' serene tranquility was shattering, replaced by a scene of utter, unadulterated bedlam. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. My only thought was to get away, away from Thorne, away from David, away from this house of horrors. I ran, my old legs pumping with a strength I hadn't known they possessed, my lungs burning, the sound of the alarms a deafening symphony of escape. I had pulled the pin on a grenade, and now I was in the middle of the explosion. I had no idea what would happen next, whether I would make it out, or whether Thorne's tendrils would drag me back into the depths of his therapeutic nightmare. But one thing was certain. The quiet, ordered world of Elysium Pines would never be the same. And neither, I suspected, would Evelyn Price. The chaos that erupted in that instant was a beautiful, terrifying thing. It was as if I'd pulled the plug on a faulty, overpressurized machine, and now all its gears were grinding, its pipes bursting, its carefully constructed illusions exploding in a shower of sparks and shrieking metal. What happened next, as I stumbled through the pandemonium I had unleashed, changed everything. You absolutely will not want to miss how this daring escape attempt unfolded, and the even greater injustices I was about to face. We've only just scratched the surface of this story, but believe me, the tension is about to ratchet up to a whole new, unbearable level. Stay with us, because the real fight for survival, and for sanity, is only just beginning. The blaring alarms and flashing emergency lights transformed the opulent wood-paneled corridors of Elysium Pines into a disorienting, Dantean landscape. White-gowned figures, some looking dazed and medicated, others surprisingly spry and agitated, milled about in confusion, their bewildered cries adding to the cacophony. Staff members in their anodyne blue and beige uniforms rushed back and forth, a mixture of panic and ingrained procedure warring on their faces. It was a scene of beautiful, liberating anarchy, and I, Evelyn Price, the instigator of this chaos, was a 72-year-old fox in a henhouse aflame, my only thought to find an exit before the farmer, in this case, the infuriated Dr. Thorne, caught me. I pushed through the throng, my small stature an advantage for once, allowing me to slip through gaps in the bewildered crowd. I had no idea where the main exit was. My arrival had been a blur, and my confinement had been absolute. My only guide was a desperate instinct for self-preservation, and the faint, almost imperceptible draft of cooler, fresher air that seemed to be coming from the far end of a long, intersecting corridor. "Mrs. Price, stop! Mrs. Price!" I heard Thorne's voice roar behind me, closer than I liked, cutting through the din with an authority that made several of the wandering patients flinch. He was surprisingly fast for a man with a limp. I didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury I couldn't afford. I ducked into a side hallway, narrower and dimmer than the main corridors. The noise of the alarms was slightly less deafening here. A series of identical, unmarked wooden doors lined the walls. Administrative offices? Storage rooms? Or more? Suites for unfortunate souls like myself and David? There was no time to investigate. I needed an exit. At the end of this hallway I saw it. A heavy steel door with a panic bar. A fire exit. My heart leapt. Could it be this easy? I threw my weight against the bar. It yielded with a satisfying clunk, and the door swung outwards, revealing not the blessed freedom of the Colorado wilderness, but a cramped windowless stairwell, dimly lit by a single, flickering emergency bulb. The air here was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and vaguely chemical. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, pricked at me, but there was no time for regret. Thorne's heavy, uneven footsteps were echoing in the main corridor behind me. This stairwell, wherever it led, was my only option. I plunged downwards, my hand ing along the cold, gritty metal railing. The stairs were steep, spiraling into the bowels of the building. Down, down, down I went, the sounds of the alarm growing fainter, replaced by the echoing thud of my own footsteps and the ragged gasps of my breath. Where was this leading? To a sub-basement, a service tunnel, or simply another dead end in this labyrinthine madhouse? After what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended abruptly at another steel door, identical to the one above. This one, however, had no panic bar, just a heavy, industrial-looking handle. I tried it, locked. Of course, it was locked. Why had I expected anything else? Despair, cold and cloying, threatened to overwhelm me. I was trapped again, this time in a claustrophobic subterranean pit, with Thorne and his minions undoubtedly closing in. I slumped against the cold steel door, my legs trembling, my lungs burning. Was this it? Was this where my desperate bid for freedom ended? And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from behind the locked door. Thump, thump, thump. It was too regular to be random. It sounded like someone was knocking, or kicking. Hope, that stubborn, irrational weed, pushed through the cracks of my despair. Could there be someone else down here? Another prisoner? Or perhaps, just perhaps, this door led to an outside service area, and someone was trying to get in due to the fire alarm? "Hello," I called out, my voice a hoarse whisper. "Is anyone there?" The thumping stopped. Then, a muffled voice, distorted by the thick steel, but unmistakably male. "Who's that? Are you staff?" "No," I cried, pressing my ear against the cold metal. "I'm a patient. Or rather, I was a patient. They locked me in. Who are you?" A pause. Then the voice again, closer now, more urgent. "My name is... It doesn't matter. This door. It's bolted from your side, isn't it? The emergency release. Can you find it?" "Bolted from my side?" I ran my hands frantically over the cold, smooth surface of the door. There was no visible bolt, no handle, no obvious mechanism. But then, my fingers brushed against a small, recessed metal plate near the bottom of the door, almost hidden in the shadows. I pushed it. Nothing. I tried to slide it. It wouldn't budge. I found a small plate," I shouted through the door. "But it's stuck." "You have to hit it," the voice yelled back, his own urgency palpable. "Hard, with something heavy. It's a pressure release for emergencies." Something heavy. I looked around the small, bare landing. Nothing. Just concrete walls and the unyielding steel door. My handbag. My blessed Poe-weighted handbag. I fumbled it open, my fingers clumsy with haste, and pulled out the heavy volume of The Complete Works of Edgar Allan Poe. Not exactly a sledgehammer, but it was solid, with sharp corners. "Stand back," I yelled, hoping he could hear me. Then, bracing myself, I swung the heavy book with all my remaining strength, aiming for the recessed metal plate. Crunch. The impact jarred my arm to the shoulder. The metal plate dented, but the bolt didn't give. "Again," the voice urged from the other side. "Harder." I swung again. And again, my breath came in ragged sobs. My muscles screamed. The heavy book felt like lead in my hands. But the thought of Thorne's approaching footsteps, of that glinting syringe, spurred me on. On the fifth blow, with a sound like a gunshot, the mechanism gave. The heavy steel door sprang inwards with a deafening clang, nearly knocking me off my feet. And there, framed in the sudden, blinding glare of what appeared to be an underground service tunnel, stood my rescuer. Or, at least, my fellow escapee. He was a man, perhaps in his late 40s, tall and gaunt, with wild, unkempt gray hair and eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. He was wearing the same drab institutional pajamas as the other patients I had glimpsed, but there was nothing docile or medicated about him. He looked like a cornered wolf, all sinew and desperate energy. In one hand, he clutched a sharpened piece of metal, possibly a spoon handle, its tip glinting menacingly. "Quick!" he hissed, grabbing my arm with a surprisingly strong grip. "They'll be down here any second. Thorne knows about this tunnel." He pulled me into the tunnel, and the steel door clanged shut behind us, plunging us into a near-total darkness, broken only by a few dim, caged emergency lights spaced far apart. The air here was even colder, heavy with the smell of damp concrete, oil, and something else. Something that reminded me, disturbingly, of a hospital morgue. "Where are we going?" I gasped, stumbling after him as he half-dragged me down the narrow, echoing passage. "Out," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "If we're lucky. This tunnel connects to the old geothermal plant. It's supposed to be abandoned. But Thorn, he uses it. Four things. The ominous ambiguity of his words sent a fresh shiver of dread down my spine. What kind of things required an abandoned geothermal plant and a secret underground tunnel? My Gothic literature-fueled imagination, already working overtime, supplied a host of gruesome possibilities. We ran, or rather, I stumbled and he pulled, through the suffocating darkness. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and turning, the sound of our frantic footsteps loud, unnatural echoes. Behind us, I could hear the distant, muffled shouts of pursuit. They knew they were coming. "I'm Evelyn Price," I managed to gasp out. Partly as an introduction, partly as a desperate assertion of my own identity in this surreal nightmare. "They call me number 12 up there," he said without slowing down. My name is Arthur Pendleton. Or it was, before Thorn decided I knew too much. Arthur Pendleton. The name meant nothing to me. But his words, "before Thorn decided I knew too much," resonated with a chilling familiarity. What had this man known? And what horrors had he endured in this so-called wellness retreat? Suddenly, Pendleton stopped, pulling me roughly into a dark alcove. "Shh," he whispered, his body pressed close to mine, his breath hot, and smelling faintly of unbrushed teeth and fear. "Listen." I held my breath. And then I heard it, ahead of us, around a bend in the tunnel. The distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door groaning open. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, confident footsteps, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible dragging sound, and a low melodic humming, a tune I vaguely recognized, something classical, something unsettlingly familiar in its current context. "Thorn," Pendleton breathed, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide with a terror that was far more profound than anything I had yet witnessed. "He's here. He's waiting for us." My blood turned to ice. We were trapped. Trapped in a dark, underground tunnel, between the pursuing orderlies behind us, and Dr. Elias Thorn, the architect of this madness, waiting for us ahead, humming a cheerful little tune, as if he were anticipating a pleasant afternoon tea rather than a confrontation with two escaped patients. Pendleton clutched his sharpened spoon handle, his knuckles white. I looked around wildly. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The tunnel was a narrow, unforgiving chute. The footsteps grew closer. The humming became more distinct. It was Bach, I realized with a jolt. One of the Brandenburg concertos. A piece my late husband, Arthur, had loved. The incongruity of it, the sheer monstrous audacity of Thorn humming Bach as he hunted us down in this subterranean hell, was almost enough to make me laugh hysterically. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. A scene from one of the very Gothic novels I had spent my life studying. But the cold dampness of the tunnel wall against my back, the smell of fear emanating from Pendleton, the relentless advance of those humming, dragging footsteps. It was all terrifyingly, undeniably real. What were we going to do? How could an old woman armed with a volume of Poe and a gaunt man wielding a sharpened spoon possibly stand against the sadistic, calculating evil of Dr. Elias Thorn and his army of enforcers? It was hopeless. Utterly, completely hopeless. Or was it? A flicker of an idea, insane, desperate, born of pure, unadulterated terror and a lifetime of devouring tales of cunning heroines outwitting monstrous villains, began to form in my mind. It was a wild gamble, a shot in the pitch-black dark. But it was the only shot we had. I grabbed Pendleton's arm, my fingers digging into his thin bicep. "Listen to me," I whispered urgently, my mind racing. "When he comes around that bend, I have a plan. It's crazy. It probably won't work, but we have to try." His wild eyes stared into mine, questioning, desperate. The footsteps were only yards away now. Thorne's humming was a cheerful, mocking counterpoint to the frantic thumping of my heart. There was no time left. We are on the absolute razor's edge of culmination here. What Evelyn is about to do, the desperate gamble she's about to take, will either be their salvation or their utter doom. Everything that has happened, every small act of defiance, every ounce of courage she has mustered, has led to this single heart-stopping moment. You simply cannot miss what happens next. The confrontation is imminent, and the fallout will be explosive. This is where the story truly ignites, and the consequences will change everything. You are on the verge of the story's most critical turning point. Stay tuned, because the next few minutes of reading will leave you breathless. The air in the tunnel grew thick, almost unbreathable, as Thorne's humming, casual and chillingly out of place, drew nearer. Pendleton was a coiled spring beside me. His makeshift shiv held tight, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I could feel the tremors running through his emaciated frame. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but a strange, almost preternatural calm had settled over my mind. It was the calm of the condemned, perhaps, or the focused clarity of a creature cornered with no option but to fight. "When I say now," I whispered, my lips almost brushing Pendleton's ear, "you scream. Scream like you're being murdered. And then, no matter what, run. Run back the way we came. Don't stop. Don't look back, understand?" He stared at me, his wild eyes uncomprehending for a beat, then a flicker of dawning, horrified understanding. "But you, what about you?" "Don't worry about me," I said, trying to inject a confidence I was far from feeling into my voice. "Just do it. It's our only chance." My plan was insane, a desperate last-ditch improvisation worthy of the most melodramatic Penny Dreadful. But in the face of Thorne's methodical, Bach-humming evil, sanity seemed like a luxury we could no longer afford. The dragging sound accompanying Thorne's footsteps was closer now. I could almost make out his silhouette against the faint, distant glow from the tunnel entrance behind him. He was taking his time, savoring the hunt. The cat playing with the cornered mice. "Get ready," I breathed. My hand, surprisingly steady, reached into my voluminous handbag. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool spine of the hefty hardcover edition of the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe, my unlikely, and so far, only weapon. Thorne rounded the bend. He stopped, perhaps 10 feet away. Even in the dim, flickering emergency light, his eyes seemed to gleam with a predatory amusement. He was taller than I remembered, more imposing. The faint antiseptic scent I associated with him was stronger here, mixed with the damp earthiness of the tunnel. He held something in his hand, something long and metallic that glinted ominously. A cane? Or something more surgical? "Well, well, well," Dr. Elias Thorne said, his voice a silken purr that did nothing to conceal the underlying menace. "Mrs. Price, and Mr. Pendleton, I presume. Out for a little subterranean constitutional, are we?" "I must say, Mrs. Price, you are proving to be a far more spirited patient than I anticipated." His lips curved into that chilling reptilian smile. "But all good things must come to an end. Playtime is over." He took a slow, deliberate step towards us. The metallic object in his hand shifted, and I saw it clearly now. Not a cane. It was a long, slender metal rod, tapered at one end, with a small, almost invisible trigger mechanism near the handle. A cattle prod? Or some bespoke instrument of torture designed for his unique therapeutic methods? I didn't want to know. Now, I screamed, the word tearing from my throat with all the force I could muster. Pendleton, to his credit, reacted instantly. He let out a blood-curdling shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed through the narrow tunnel, bouncing off the damp concrete walls, loud enough to wake the dead, or at least to startle a sadistic psychiatrist. And then, as instructed, he turned and bolted, scrambling back down the tunnel towards the faint, distant hope of the fire exit, his bare feet slapping against the gritty floor. Thorne, momentarily taken aback by the sheer volume and unexpectedness of Pendleton's scream, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his head turned, following Pendleton's retreating figure. That was the opening I needed. With a cry that was more animalistic snarl than human utterance, I lunged. Not at Thorne directly, but to the side, towards the tunnel wall. And as I moved, I swung my Poe-laden handbag with the desperate strength of a cornered grandmother fighting for her life and the life of her child. I wasn't aiming for his head, or even his body. I was aiming for the glinting metal rod in his hand. Crack! The sound of the heavy book connecting with the metal rod was shockingly loud in the confined space. The impact sent a jarring shockwave up my arm, and the book flew from my grasp, skittering across the grimy floor. But it had done its job. The metal rod clattered from Thorne's hand, spinning away into the darkness. He swore, a vicious, guttural sound, and lunged for me, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. His enlightened composure had vanished, replaced by the raw fury of a thwarted predator. I didn't try to fight him. I was no match for his strength. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I dropped to the ground, curled into a tight ball, and screamed again, as loud and as piercingly as I could, "Fire! Fire in the tunnel! He's got a weapon! He's trying to kill us! Fire!" My voice, amplified by the tunnel's acoustics, became a deafening, hysterical shriek. I hoped, prayed, that the orderlies pursuing Pendleton would hear it, that the sheer panic in my voice would sow confusion, create a diversion. Thorne was on top of me in an instant, his hands grabbing at my shoulders, trying to silence me. His face was inches from mine, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying light. "You senile old hag," he hissed, his breath smelling faintly of expensive mints and something else, something stale, like old secrets. "I'll silence you permanently." His fingers tightened on my throat. I clawed at his hands, kicked out with my feet, but it was like fighting a steel automaton. Spots danced before my eyes. My lungs burned. This was it. He was going to kill me. Here in this filthy, forgotten tunnel, where no one would ever find me. And then salvation came from the most unexpected quarter. A series of loud, echoing thwacks reverberated through the tunnel, followed by Thorne letting out a yelp of pain and surprise. His grip on my throat loosened. I gasped for air, coughing, my vision swimming. Dazed, I looked up. Standing over Thorne, who was now clutching his arm and staggering back, was David, my son. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes still holding a residual wildness, but something else was there too. A dawning horror. A flicker of the gentle, tormented boy I knew, breaking through the monstrous facade Thorne had constructed. In his hand he wielded the heavy, hardback volume of the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe, which he must have snatched up after I'd dropped it. He was holding it like a club, his knuckles white. "Get away from my mother, you bastard!" David snarled, his voice raw, unrecognizable, yet filled with a protective fury that stunned me to the core. Thorne stared at David, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. You ungrateful whelp. After everything I've done for you. I gave you clarity. I gave you freedom. You gave me nightmares, David shouted, taking a menacing step forward, the book held high. You twisted my mind. You tried to make me hurt her, my own mother. He looked at me then, a fleeting, anguished glance. Mom, are you okay? Before I could answer, before Thorne could react, the tunnel behind us erupted with noise. The thudding footsteps of the orderlies, closer now, their shouts echoing. And, surprisingly, Pendleton's voice, still screaming, but now with a different inflection. He's got a hostage. Thorne's got a hostage down here, and he started a fire. Pendleton. That clever, desperate man. He hadn't just run. He was creating a diversion, a counternarrative. A fire. A hostage. That would bring more than just Thorne's private goons. That might just bring real help. Thorne seemed to realize this too. His eyes darted between me, David, and the approaching sounds of the orderlies. He was trapped. His carefully controlled environment spiraling into chaos. His authority challenged by the very patients he sought to dominate. For a moment he looked utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, the reptilian smile gone. But then, his eyes narrowed and a new, colder cunning entered them. He couldn't win by force now. But perhaps he could still salvage something. This changes nothing, Mrs. Price, he said, his voice regaining some of its silken menace, though it was now laced with a tremor of desperation. You have no proof. No one will believe the ramblings of a senile old woman and 2 delusional patients. I am Dr. Elias Thorne. My reputation. Your reputation, doctor, I said, my voice hoarse but surprisingly firm, as I struggled to my feet, leaning against David for support, is about to become as toxic as the drugs you peddle in this snake pit. I fumbled in the pocket of my torn house dress. My fingers closed around a small, hard object. The burner phone. Battered, its screen cracked. But I had managed to retrieve it in the initial chaos when David had first snatched it from me in my room, before he'd fully realized what he was doing, before Thorne's orderlies had burst in. I'd palmed it, shoved it deep into my pocket, a tiny, desperate gamble. And now, I held it up, its screen dark, its life force seemingly extinguished. Perhaps no one will believe me, doctor, I said, my voice gaining strength. But I wonder, will they believe this? I pressed the call log button, praying there was enough battery power left for one last miracle. The cracked screen flickered, and then it illuminated. Dimly, almost illegibly, but there it was. The last number dialed. 911. And beside it, the call duration. 0 hours and 47 seconds. 47 seconds. 47 seconds of my desperate plea for help. Recorded, logged, irrefutable. Thorne stared at the phone, his face turning an ugly mottled gray. He knew what it meant. A 911 call, even an interrupted one, from inside his facility, alleging false imprisonment, would trigger an automatic, and very unwelcome, investigation by outside authorities. The kind of investigation that couldn't be easily swept under the rug, not even by a man with his connections. The orderlies, led by the ever-officious Mr. Grayson, burst around the bend in the tunnel, their expressions a mixture of alarm and aggression. They stopped short, taking in the scene. Thorne, disheveled and furious. David, standing protectively in front of me, wielding a volume of Gothic literature like a battle-axe. And me, battered but defiant, holding up a nearly dead cell phone as if it were the Holy Grail. Dr. Thorne, are you all right, sir? Grayson blustered, his eyes darting nervously between us. What's all this about a fire? A hostage? Before Thorne could concoct another lie, before he could regain control of the narrative, I spoke, my voice clear and carrying, despite my exhaustion. "There is no fire, Mr. Grayson," I said. "But there is a hostage situation. Or rather, there was. Dr. Thorne has been holding me, and my son, and who knows how many other unfortunate souls against our will. He has been drugging us, isolating us, and attempting to defraud us of our assets. And I have the proof." I brandished the little phone. "This call to 911 was made from inside this facility just moments ago. I suggest you all consider your next actions very, very carefully. Because the outside world, Mr. Grayson, is now listening." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant fading wail of the fire alarms, which, I suspected, Pendleton was now enthusiastically re-triggering at every pull station he could find. The orderlies looked at Thorne, then at me, then back at Thorne, their faces a mixture of confusion, dawning apprehension, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of fear. The power dynamic in that subterranean tunnel had just shifted, irrevocably. Dr. Elias Thorne, the master manipulator, the god of his own private asylum, looked, for the first time since I had met him, utterly, completely, and beautifully checkmated. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, a stark contrast to the bedlam I had unleashed. The arrival of local sheriff's deputies, alerted by the 911 dispatch and possibly by Pendleton's increasingly frantic and embellished reports of fire and mayhem, threw Elysium Pines into an official lockdown. But this time it was Thorne and his staff who were on the receiving end. My cracked burner phone, with its precious 47-second call log, became Exhibit A. David, surprisingly lucid now that the immediate threat had passed and the fog of whatever Thorne had been pumping into him was beginning to lift, gave a halting but coherent account of his own experiences, of the clarity sessions that felt more like brainwashing, of the drugs that left him disoriented and suggestible. Arthur Pendleton, when he was finally located, he'd barricaded himself in the main kitchen, armed with a meat cleaver and demanding a helicopter, provided a rambling but ultimately damning testimony about his own years of confinement and the experiments he claimed Thorne conducted in the lower levels. Thorne, of course, blustered and threatened. He spoke of patient confidentiality, of slander, of powerful friends in high places. But the presence of uniformed officers, the official investigation now underway, and the undeniable evidence of that 911 call had stripped him of his usual arrogant invincibility. He looked smaller, almost pathetic, without his white coat and his sycophantic retinue. Mr. Grayson, ever the pragmatist, quickly tried to distance himself from his employer, claiming he was merely following orders, that he had no knowledge of any improprieties. The other staff members, faced with potential criminal charges, began to sing like canaries, each trying to paint themselves as unwitting pawns in Thorne's grand nefarious scheme. The facade of Elysium Pines, so carefully constructed, so expensively maintained, was crumbling with astonishing speed. David and I were taken to a local hospital for evaluation. I was treated for dehydration, bruises, and exhaustion. David, it turned out, had been subjected to a cocktail of powerful psychotropic drugs and so-called truth serums, designed to break down his will and make him more susceptible to Thorne's influence. Particularly, it seemed, influence regarding the disposition of my estate, should I be declared incompetent. The doctors said it would take time and intensive therapy for him to fully recover from the chemical assault on his mind. But the fog was already lifting. The gentle, intelligent son I remembered was slowly, painfully, re-emerging from the wreckage. The investigation into Elysium Pines and Dr. Elias Thorne became a statewide, then a national, sensation. My story, and the stories of other patients, who were subsequently discovered and released, painted a horrifying picture of medical malpractice, false imprisonment, financial fraud, and psychological torture, all hidden behind a veneer of luxury and holistic wellness. The elite retreat was revealed to be little more than a high-priced gulag for the inconvenient elderly and the wealthy mentally vulnerable. Thorne was eventually arrested, his assets frozen, his medical license revoked. He faced a barrage of lawsuits and criminal charges that would keep him entangled in the legal system for the rest of his miserable life. Elysium Pines was shut down, its remaining patients transferred to legitimate facilities or released to their families. The dark, imposing building in the Colorado mountains stood empty, a monument to greed and hubris. For David and me, the journey back to normalcy was long and challenging. He entered a reputable rehabilitation program, not one of Thorne's choosing, to deal with the psychological trauma and the lingering effects of the drugs. I returned to my quiet life in Chicago, to my books, my cat, and my rescued hummingbirds. But something had changed within me. The quiet, somewhat reclusive literary scholar had discovered a core of steel she hadn't known she possessed. The experience had been terrifying, traumatic, but it had also been strangely liberating. I had faced down a monster, and I had survived. More than that, I had fought back. My relationship with David was forever altered. The old, easy dynamic was gone, replaced by something more complex, more fragile, yet ultimately, perhaps, more honest. There was guilt, of course, on his part, a profound and soul-crushing shame for his role in my ordeal, however manipulated he had been. And for me, there was a lingering sadness, a grief for the son I had almost lost, and for the trust that had been so cruelly shattered. But there was also a new tentative understanding, a shared experience of survival that bound us together in an unexpected way. He had, in that final desperate moment in the tunnel, chosen me. He had fought for me. And that, I knew, was the foundation upon which we could, perhaps, begin to rebuild. Arthur Pendleton, number 12, became something of an unlikely friend. Once he was stabilized and assured he was truly free, his wildness subsided, revealing a sharp, eccentric intellect and a surprisingly wry sense of humor. He had been an investigative journalist, he told me, working on an exposé of unregulated wellness cults, when he had gotten too close to Thorne's operation and had been forcibly admitted to Elysium Pines. His delusions, it turned out, had been inconvenient truths. He was now writing a book about his experiences, and he often called me for corroborating details and, I suspected, for the simple comfort of a shared understanding. Life, as it often does, moved on. The headlines faded. The scandal became yesterday's news. But for those of us who had passed through the shadowed corridors of Elysium Pines, the experience left an indelible mark. It was a stark reminder that evil can wear the most respectable of masks, that vulnerability can be exploited in the most insidious of ways, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in grand heroic gestures, but in the quiet, desperate refusal to surrender, armed with nothing more than a mother's love, a volume of Poe, and an unshakable belief in the power of truth. And every now and then, when I hear a piece by Bach, particularly the Brandenburg concertos, I don't think of my late husband anymore. I think of a dark, damp tunnel, of a humming, methodical evil, and of the surprising, terrifying, and ultimately triumphant moment when an old woman decided that playtime was indeed over. We've reached the very precipice of the story's true climax and its far-reaching consequences. The confrontation in that tunnel was just the spark that ignited the inferno. What unfolds now, as the authorities descend and the full rotten core of Elysium Pines is exposed, will shake everything to its foundations. You are on the verge of witnessing how one woman's desperate courage can unravel a vast conspiracy and bring a powerful, corrupt system crashing down. The revelations are about to get darker, the stakes higher, and the fight for justice will demand a price you can't yet imagine. This is the culmination. Everything you've been waiting for, the takedown, the reckoning, the unmasking of true evil, is right here. You simply cannot afford to miss how Evelyn Price, armed with her wits and the truth, systematically dismantles an empire built on lies and suffering. Stay with us, because this is where the hero truly rises, and the villains get everything they deserve. The immediate aftermath of our escape from the tunnel was less a triumphant liberation, and more a chaotic, disorienting transition into yet another form of institutional bureaucracy, albeit one with flashing blue lights and the reassuring presence of actual law enforcement. Sheriff's deputies, initially responding to a fire alarm and reports of a hostage situation at an exclusive and notoriously private mountain retreat, found themselves wading into a scenario far more complex and disturbing than they could have anticipated. I, still trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, clutching my cracked burner phone like a talisman, was a primary witness. David, looking pale and shaky but surprisingly lucid, corroborated my account of being held against our will, of the forced medication, of Dr. Thorne's increasingly unhinged behavior, and his chilling pronouncements about new therapeutic plateaus that sounded suspiciously like brainwashing. Arthur Pendleton, once he was convinced that the deputies weren't Thorne's men in disguise, launched into a passionate, if somewhat rambling, tirade about mind control experiments, illegal drug trials, and a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the pharmaceutical industry. He was, to put it mildly, a handful, but his genuine terror and the sheer conviction in his voice lent a bizarre credibility to his wilder claims. Dr. Thorne, predictably, attempted to regain control. He emerged from the tunnel shortly after us, his expensive suit now smudged with dirt, his reptilian composure replaced by a mask of outraged indignation. He alternately threatened legal action against the sheriff's department for trespassing and disrupting his vital therapeutic work, and then tried to paint me as a senile, hysterical old woman, David as a dangerously unstable addict in the throes of a psychotic episode, and Pendleton as a long-term paranoid schizophrenic. He even had the audacity to suggest that I had assaulted him in the tunnel, and that my 911 call was a malicious fabrication. "This facility, Sheriff," Thorne declared, his voice dripping with condescension, "is a sanctuary for those suffering from the most delicate and complex mental afflictions. We deal with fragile minds, with distorted perceptions of reality. It is not uncommon for patients, particularly during acute phases of their illness, to exhibit paranoid ideation and fabricate elaborate persecutory narratives." He gestured towards me with a pitying sigh. Mrs. Price, sadly, is a textbook example. Her son, in a moment of lucidity, was merely trying to prevent her from harming herself or others when she initiated this unfortunate disturbance. It was a masterful performance, the kind of smooth, authoritative gaslighting that had probably worked wonders for him for years. I could see a flicker of doubt in the eyes of the younger deputy. But the older officer, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Miller with tired eyes that had seen too much, wasn't buying it. My cracked phone, with its logged 911 call, was a small, hard piece of evidence that didn't fit Thorne's narrative. And the sheer, palpable terror emanating from me, David, and Pendleton was difficult to dismiss as mere paranoid ideation. "We'll need to take statements from everyone, Doctor," Sergeant Miller said, his voice non-committal. "And we'll need to inspect your facility, standard procedure given the nature of the emergency call. Thorne's eyes narrowed. An inspection, without a warrant. On what grounds, Sergeant? On the grounds of a reported felony in progress, Doctor, Miller replied, his tone hardening. False imprisonment, assault, possibly kidnapping. And until we can sort this out, I'm afraid Elysium Pines is now an active crime scene. That phrase, active crime scene, seemed to visibly deflate Thorne. The color drained from his face. His powerful friends might be able to quash a local zoning dispute or smooth over a minor tax irregularity. But a full-blown criminal investigation, with a national media spotlight almost certainly to follow? That was a different beast entirely. David and I were transported by ambulance to a small community hospital in the nearest mountain town. Pendleton, still agitated but somewhat calmer now that he was out of Elysium Pines, followed in a separate patrol car, providing a running, highly embellished commentary to the unfortunate deputy tasked with escorting him. At the hospital, I was prodded, poked, and examined. Blood was drawn, X-rays taken. The bruises from my fall and Thorne's assault were documented. The emergency room doctor, a young woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently to my story, her expression growing increasingly grave. Mrs. Price, she said, after completing her examination, the substances Dr. Thorne was allegedly administering to your son, and perhaps to you, based on your description of the calming injections. They are not standard therapeutic agents. Some of them sound like powerful sedatives, even anesthetics. Not appropriate for long-term psychiatric care, especially without rigorous monitoring. And your son's blood work shows anomalies. We'll need to run more tests. Anomalies. The word hung in the air, cold and ominous. What had Thorne been doing to David? To the other patients trapped in his mountain fortress? The next few days were a blur of police interviews, depositions, and calls from concerned hospital social workers. My daughter Claire, a high-powered attorney in Chicago, arrived like a force of nature, her initial shock and horror quickly transforming into a focused legal fury. She immediately took charge, liaising with the sheriff's department, consulting with local Colorado lawyers, and ensuring that David and I were protected from any further attempts by Thorne or his cronies to intimidate or discredit us. They're going to try and paint you as unreliable, Mom, Claire warned, her voice tight with anger. They'll dig into your past, David's past, looking for anything they can use to undermine your credibility. We need to be prepared. And they did. Thorne's expensive legal team, a pack of sleek, merciless sharks from Denver, immediately went on the offensive. They filed counterclaims of harassment, trespass, and damage to property. My dramatic fire alarm pull and subsequent escape had apparently caused significant disruption and distress to the other, vulnerable patients. They leaked carefully selected, out-of-context snippets from David's old medical records to sympathetic media outlets, painting him as a chronic, unstable addict with a history of violent outbursts. They even tried to suggest that I had a history of senile dementia and persecutory delusions, dredging up a minor fainting spell I'd had a few years prior after a bout of flu as proof of my declining mental state. It was a dirty, vicious fight. And for a while, it felt like we were drowning in a sea of lies and obfuscation. The sheer power and resources arrayed against us were daunting. Thorne had powerful allies, wealthy donors, influential board members, who were all heavily invested in protecting Elysium Pines' reputation and their own involvement in its lucrative, if ethically questionable, operations. But we had something Thorne didn't count on: the truth, and, as it turned out, we weren't entirely alone. Arthur Pendleton, once his initial paranoia subsided and he was under the care of legitimate mental health professionals, who quickly diagnosed him not as schizophrenic, but as suffering from severe PTSD, resulting from prolonged psychological abuse and probable drugging, became an unexpectedly articulate and compelling witness. His years as an investigative journalist, though suppressed and almost extinguished by Thorne, reasserted themselves. He had, it turned out, kept meticulous, albeit cryptic, notes during his confinement, hidden in the hollowed-out legs of his bedside table. These notes, once deciphered, provided a horrifying roadmap of Thorne's experimental therapies, his obsession with consciousness alteration, and his callous disregard for patient well-being. Pendleton even had names, dates, and details of other patients who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, or whose treatments had gone catastrophically wrong. And then there were the other families. As news of the Elysium Pines scandal began to spread, a trickle, then a flood of other people began to come forward. Sons and daughters who had been denied access to their elderly parents. Spouses who had been told their loved ones were too unstable for visits. People who had poured their life savings into Thorne's promises of miraculous cures, only to find their relatives emerging more broken, more traumatized than when they went in. A class-action lawsuit began to take shape, with Claire and a team of tenacious Colorado lawyers at its helm. The linchpin, however, remained David. His testimony was crucial. But he was still fragile, still struggling with the aftereffects of the drugs and the psychological manipulation he had endured. Thorne's lawyers knew this. They did everything they could to discredit him, to portray him as an unreliable witness, a pawn in his mother's vindictive crusade. The preliminary hearings were brutal. David was subjected to hours of relentless, insinuating cross-examination. They dredged up every mistake he had ever made, every youthful indiscretion, every period of depression or anxiety. They tried to twist his love for me into an unhealthy codependent obsession, his desire to protect me in the tunnel into an act of unprovoked aggression. There were moments when I saw him falter, when the old insecurities, the old self-doubt, threatened to overwhelm him. I sat in the courtroom, my heart aching for him, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles were white. I wanted to scream at those smug, predatory lawyers, to shield him from their vicious attacks. But I knew he had to do this himself. He had to find his own voice, his own strength, and he did. Slowly, haltingly at first, then with a growing, quiet conviction, David told his story. He spoke of Thorne's insidious charm, of the promises of enlightenment and healing, of the special treatments that left him feeling disoriented, terrified, his own thoughts no longer his own. He spoke of the fear, the isolation, the crushing despair. And he spoke of that moment in the tunnel, when he had seen Thorne attacking me, and something within him had snapped, some primal protective instinct, overriding years of brainwashing and chemical coercion. He was hurting my mother, David said, his voice thick with emotion, looking directly at the judge. And I knew then that whatever Dr. Thorne had told me, whatever he had made me believe, it was all a lie. Because the one true thing I've always known, the one thing he couldn't take away from me, was that I love my mother, and I would never, ever, let anyone hurt her. The courtroom was silent. Even Thorne's lawyers seemed momentarily stunned by the raw, unvarnished emotion in his voice. In that moment, he wasn't an addict or a delusional patient. He was a son, fighting for his mother, fighting for his own soul, and it was powerful. The turning point in the public perception of the case, however, came from an unexpected source. The local newspaper in that small Colorado mountain town, the Mountain Chronicle, had a young, ambitious investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins. No relation to my Arthur, though I later joked they must be kindred spirits. Sarah had been covering the Elysium Pines story from the beginning, with a tenacity that belied her youth and the paper's small circulation. She wasn't content with the official press releases and the carefully managed sound bites from Thorne's legal team. She started digging. She interviewed former staff members who had left Elysium Pines under mysterious circumstances. She tracked down families of patients who had died there, their deaths attributed to natural causes, despite their relatively good health upon admission. She uncovered a pattern of suspicious financial transactions, of large sums of money being transferred from patients' accounts to offshore corporations controlled by Thorne. And then, she found the hummingbird lady. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had found solace in rescuing small creatures at Elysium Pines. A former kitchen worker, a quiet, elderly immigrant woman named Maria, had been secretly feeding and caring for injured birds and small animals she found on the vast, isolated grounds of the facility. She had witnessed things. She had overheard conversations. She had seen patients being forcibly medicated, being dragged to special treatment rooms in the lower levels, the same lower levels Pendleton had spoken of. She had been too afraid to speak out while she worked there, terrified of losing her job, her only means of support. But now, with the facility shut down and Thorne under investigation, she found the courage to tell her story to Sarah Jenkins. Maria's testimony, published in a series of explosive articles in the Mountain Chronicle, and then picked up by national news outlets, was devastating. She spoke of the quiet rooms, where patients were left for days in drugged stupors, of the water therapy, that sounded suspiciously like waterboarding, of Thorne's obsessive belief in his own godlike powers to remold human consciousness. She even remembered seeing David, looking like a lost soul, being led by Thorne into those lower levels, and hearing his muffled cries later that night. The hummingbird lady's story, so simple, so old, so full of unassailable human detail, cut through all the legal jargon and the sophisticated spin from Thorne's defense team. It painted a picture of Elysium Pines not as a wellness retreat, but as a private fiefdom ruled by a sadistic charlatan, a real-life house of usher, nestled in the idyllic Colorado mountains. The public outcry was immense. Thorne's powerful friends began to desert him like rats from a sinking ship. The federal investigation intensified. More victims came forward. The carefully constructed empire of Dr. Elias Thorne, built on lies, cruelty, and the exploitation of human suffering, was finally, irrevocably, beginning to crumble. And I, Evelyn Price, the old woman with a penchant for Gothic literature and a surprisingly effective handbag, found myself an unlikely symbol of resistance, a testament to the fact that even in the face of overwhelming power and insidious evil, one determined voice, amplified by the truth, could indeed shake the foundations of a corrupt world. The battle was far from over, the legal complexities immense. But as I sat with David, now truly on the road to recovery, and with Claire, my fierce and brilliant daughter, by my side, I knew, with a certainty that warmed me to my core, that we were no longer just fighting for ourselves. We were fighting for all the silent, forgotten souls trapped in their own versions of Elysium Pines. And that was a fight we were determined to win. The story has reached a critical juncture, the kind that leaves you desperate to know what happens when the dust settles. We've seen the depths of Thorne's depravity, and the incredible courage of Evelyn, and those who rallied to her side. But the fight isn't over. The legal battles, the personal healing, the quest for true justice, it's all about to enter a new, even more intense phase. What we've experienced so far is merely the prelude to a reckoning that will be truly epic. You are on the absolute verge of the story's most profound emotional and legal climaxes. What happens now, as the full weight of the justice system bears down, and as Evelyn and David navigate the treacherous path to recovery and rebuilding, will leave you utterly astonished. You simply cannot miss the final, breathtaking chapters of this extraordinary saga. This is the culmination. Everything you've been waiting for, the ultimate takedown, the painful but necessary healing, and the inspiring resilience of the human spirit, is about to unfold. Stay with us to witness how one seemingly ordinary woman, armed with an extraordinary will, not only reclaims her life, but also becomes a beacon of hope for countless others. The most powerful moments are yet to come. The wheels of justice, as they say, grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. The months that followed the initial explosive revelations about Elysium Pines were a marathon, not a sprint. Dr. Elias Thorne, stripped of his medical license and facing a mountain of criminal charges and civil lawsuits, fought like a cornered rat, employing every legal trick, every delay tactic, every ounce of his remaining influence to evade accountability. His once powerful friends had largely abandoned him, but he still had access to considerable, albeit ill-gotten wealth, and he used it to fund a scorched-earth legal defense. For David and me, and for the dozens of other families whose lives had been shattered by Thorne's reign of terror, it was an agonizingly slow process. There were endless depositions, pre-trial hearings, motions and counter-motions. Thorne's lawyers, a particularly odious breed of corporate barracudas, tried every tactic to discredit us. They portrayed me as a vengeful, manipulative old woman, David as an unreliable, drug-addled fantasist, and Arthur Pendleton as a certifiable lunatic whose testimony was worthless. They attempted to bury Claire and her legal team under an avalanche of paperwork, hoping to exhaust our resources and our resolve, but they underestimated us. They underestimated the quiet, steely determination of a mother fighting for her son and for justice. They underestimated Claire's brilliant legal mind and her unwavering commitment. They underestimated Arthur Pendleton's surprisingly meticulous, if eccentrically organized, documentation of his years of captivity. And they grossly underestimated the power of collective action, as more and more families, emboldened by our fight, joined the class action lawsuit, their stories adding to the damning chorus against Thorne. The foundation for elder justice, which I had established with the initial settlement from my personal ordeal with Silver Willows, a different, earlier battle, but one that had prepared me for this larger war, became the nerve center for our efforts. It provided legal support, counseling, and a unified voice for the victims of Elysium Pines. My small office, once a haven for quiet literary contemplation, was now a bustling command post, filled with ringing phones, dedicated volunteers, and the quiet hum of justice being painstakingly assembled, piece by piece. David, throughout this grueling period, continued his slow but steady recovery. The therapy was helping. The fog of Thorne's drugs was lifting, revealing the intelligent, sensitive man I had always known, albeit one now bearing deep scars. He found an unexpected solace in art therapy, his drawings and paintings becoming a powerful outlet for the trauma he had endured. And, to my immense pride, he began to use his experiences to help others. He started volunteering at a local crisis hotline, his quiet empathy and first-hand understanding of psychological manipulation, making him an invaluable resource for people struggling with their own demons. He was transforming his pain into purpose, a journey I understood all too well. The turning point in the legal battle came not in a dramatic courtroom confrontation, but through the quiet, meticulous work of forensic accountants. Following the breadcrumbs left by Thorne's complex web of offshore corporations and shell companies, a path illuminated by Pendleton's surprisingly detailed notes, and my own IRS-honed instincts, they uncovered a massive, multi-million-dollar scheme of Medicare fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Elysium Pines, it turned out, wasn't just a private asylum for psychological torture. It was the glittering, deceptive hub of a vast criminal enterprise. Thorne hadn't just been playing God with people's minds, he'd been systematically plundering their assets and defrauding the government on an epic scale. This financial evidence, cold, hard, and irrefutable, was the nail in Thorne's coffin. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison for financial crimes, which often carry stiffer, less parole-friendly sentences than even violent offenses, Thorne's bravado finally cracked. His high-powered legal team, seeing the writing on the wall, began to negotiate a plea deal. The plea bargain, when it was finally announced, was a bitter pill for many of the victims, including myself. Thorne would plead guilty to a reduced number of charges, including several counts of fraud and 1 count of reckless endangerment. He would serve time, yes, but not nearly as much as we felt he deserved for the lives he had ruined, the minds he had twisted, the trust he had so monstrously betrayed. There would be no dramatic trial where he would be forced to confront the full extent of his cruelty in open court. I remember sitting with Claire and David in Arthur Jenkins's law office. Yes, that Arthur, my lawyer friend, not Pendleton, though Pendleton was also there, fuming quietly in a corner, as the terms of the plea were explained. A part of me, the part that still burned with a cold, righteous fury, wanted to reject it, to demand our day in court, to see Thorne publicly humiliated and condemned. But Claire, ever the pragmatist, laid out the realities. Mom, a trial would take years. It would be incredibly expensive, emotionally draining, and the outcome, despite everything, is never guaranteed. Juries can be unpredictable. Witnesses can falter. This plea deal, it's not perfect, but it's a conviction. He goes to prison. His name is disgraced. His ability to harm others is permanently curtailed. And the settlement fund for the victims, which is part of this deal, will be substantial. Sometimes, Mom, a hard-won, imperfect justice is better than no justice at all. David, surprisingly, echoed her sentiment. I don't want to see his face again, Mom, he said quietly, his voice still holding a trace of the old trauma. I don't want to relive it all in court. I want it to be over. I want to move on. And so, with a heavy heart but a clear mind, I agreed. We all did. Arthur Pendleton grumbled about letting the monster off easy, but even he, in his more lucid moments, understood the pragmatic wisdom of Claire's counsel. Dr. Elias Thorne, the self-proclaimed visionary, the healer of souls, the man who had believed himself above the law, was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He was stripped of his remaining assets. His name became a byword for medical charlatanism and corporate greed. Elysium Pines, the beautiful, menacing castle in the mountains, was eventually sold off, its dark secrets buried under new ownership and a desperate rebranding campaign. For us, the survivors, life began to find a new, quieter rhythm. The Foundation for Elder Justice, bolstered by the settlement funds, expanded its operations, becoming a national voice for reform and advocacy. I poured my energy into its work, finding a profound sense of purpose in helping others avoid the horrors I had endured. My book, The Hummingbird's Cage, a memoir of Elysium Pines, became an unexpected bestseller, further raising awareness and providing a platform for other victims to share their stories. David continued his healing journey. He eventually went back to school, not for computer programming, but for social work, specializing in addiction counseling. He wanted to use his own painful experiences to help others navigate the treacherous waters of recovery. He and we found a new way to be mother and son, a relationship built not on illusion or obligation, but on a shared understanding of human frailty, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. We never fully regained the easy intimacy of his childhood. The shadow of his betrayal was too long for that. But we found a quiet respect, a deep and abiding affection. Arthur Pendleton, with the help of a good ghostwriter, published his own explosive account of his years at Elysium Pines, Thorne's Labyrinth. It was a wild, sprawling, sometimes paranoid, but ultimately compelling narrative that shed further light on the bizarre and cruel therapies practiced within those walls. He became an eccentric but passionate advocate for patients' rights. His sharpened spoon handle now a symbolic paperweight on his cluttered desk. And what of the final transformation of the antagonist? Dr. Elias Thorne, in the sterile confines of his prison cell, had ample time to reflect on his vision. Did he find remorse? Did he confront the monstrous ego that had driven him to such cruelty? I doubt it. Men like Thorne rarely change. Their narcissism is too deeply ingrained, their capacity for self-deception too profound. His defeat was not a moral awakening, but a simple, brutal consequence of being outmaneuvered, of his carefully constructed world collapsing under the weight of his own hubris and the relentless pursuit of justice by those he had wronged. His transformation was merely the stripping away of his power, his influence, his freedom. And for his victims, that was transformation enough. As for me, Evelyn Price, I found my own transformation not in the dramatic takedown of a villain, but in the quiet daily acts of rebuilding, of advocacy, of finding purpose in the aftermath of trauma. The rescue of that tiny hummingbird, on the day this whole nightmare began, had been a small act of grace, a foreshadowing perhaps of the larger battles to come. Life, I learned, is a tapestry woven with threads of both darkness and light. And sometimes, it is only by navigating the deepest shadows that we truly come to appreciate the brilliance of the dawn. My golden autumn had taken a detour through a Gothic winter, but spring had finally, blessedly arrived. And it was more vibrant, more precious than I could ever have imagined. This journey through the shadows of Elysium Pines has been a harrowing one, filled with betrayal, injustice, and the terrifying abuse of power. But it has also been a story of incredible courage, unexpected alliances, and the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. Evelyn's fight reminds us that even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, one voice, armed with truth and determination, can spark a revolution. It underscores the vital importance of vigilance, of questioning authority, and of protecting the most vulnerable among us. The battle for justice is often long and arduous, but as Evelyn's story demonstrates, it is a battle worth fighting, for ourselves, and for those who cannot fight for themselves. If this story of an ordinary woman who accomplished extraordinary things has moved you, if it has made you think, or perhaps even inspired you to look more closely at the world around you, then our purpose here is fulfilled. We believe in the power of storytelling to illuminate, to challenge, and to ultimately empower. Don't forget to subscribe and join our community for more narratives that delve into the complexities of the human heart and the enduring quest for truth and justice. Thank you for sharing this journey with us.